Hey guys. Tonight we're diving into something that'll make you question every fairy tale you ever dismissed as pure fantasy. Because as it turns out, the Middle Ages were absolutely brimming with events so bizarre, so improbable, so deliciously weird that modern historians had to triple-check their sources before admitting, yes, this actually happened. And you're about to discover that the line between legend and reality in medieval times was thinner than a monk's patience during a fasting week. So settle in, because you probably won't survive this journey through documented strangeness without at least one moment of sitting up in bed and muttering "no way" into the darkness of your room. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying there in your modern bed with your weighted blanket and memory foam pillow, completely removed from an era when people genuinely believed that drilling a hole in someone's skull could release evil spirits. A practice called trepanation that archaeologists have found evidence of in thousands of medieval skulls, many of which show signs of bone healing, meaning yes, people survived having chunks of their heads removed with what amounted to a carpentry tool and a prayer. And you're beginning to understand that what we call legends were often just Tuesday afternoons in the year 1247, and as you breathe in slowly through your nose and out through your mouth, you're transported to a world where the impossible happened with such regularity that scribes didn't even bother adding exclamation points to their chronicles. They just wrote, and then the sky turned blood red for 3 days with the same energy you'd use to describe finding your keys. Because medieval record keepers were apparently the most unflappable people in history, witnessing miracles and monstrosities with equal amounts of, well, better write this down I suppose, energy that honestly we could all learn from in our age of social media hysteria. You're starting to feel that pleasant heaviness in your limbs now, that sensation of sinking into your mattress as if it's slowly becoming quicksand made of comfort. And in this relaxed state, you're more receptive to the story of the Maid of Norway, a little girl named Margaret, who was technically Queen of Scotland, despite never setting foot in the country as a ruling monarch, because medieval politics were basically a Game of Thrones before that was even a phrase, and this poor 7-year-old was being shipped from Norway to Scotland in 1290, when she died en route, either from seasickness or food poisoning, or just the general horror of medieval ocean travel, which was basically like riding a wooden roller coaster through a hurricane, while people threw up in buckets next to you. And here's where it gets legendary. Several women later claimed to be Margaret, insisting they'd survived and were the rightful queen, leading to a situation historians now call the Great Cause, where English King Edward I got to play judge in deciding Scotland's succession, which worked out exactly as well as you'd expect when you let a foreign monarch arbitrate your domestic disputes. Spoiler alert, not well, and you're feeling even drowsier now, as you consider how this one little girl's death sparked decades of conflict that included William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, and basically the entire plot of Braveheart, which is actually less historically accurate than your average medieval legend, but more entertaining, so there's a trade-off there that Hollywood has always been comfortable making. The room around you is fading into that soft focus quality where sounds become muffled and distant, like you're underwater but in the best possible way, and you're ready to hear about the Beast of Gévaudan, which between 1764 and 1767 terrorized rural France by killing somewhere between 60 and 100 people, mostly women and children who were out tending sheep. And this wasn't some superstitious village tale that got exaggerated in the retelling. This was documented by King Louis XV's own administrators, who sent multiple hunting parties to kill whatever this thing was, and witnesses described it as wolf-like but enormous, with reddish fur and a stripe down its back, and a mouth that seemed too wide. And here's the thing that makes this legend shockingly true. Whatever this creature was, it was real, it was killing people, and the French government spent a fortune trying to stop it, eventually declaring victory when a local hunter named Jean Chastel killed a large wolf in 1767, after which the attacks stopped, but scholars still debate whether it was a wolf, a hyena that escaped from some nobleman's menagerie, a trained attack dog, or possibly a hybrid animal that shouldn't have existed but somehow did, because medieval nature was apparently running an experimental breeding program that modern zookeepers would find ethically questionable at best. And as you sink deeper into your pillows, you're probably glad that apex predators with identity crises aren't roaming around your neighborhood. Though honestly, given some of the wildlife encounters people post online these days, maybe we're not that far removed from our medieval ancestors after all. Your breathing is steady now, that perfect rhythm that happens when your body starts shutting down non-essential systems in preparation for sleep, and you're perfectly positioned to appreciate the story of the Children's Crusade of 1212, which sounds like something a medieval fantasy author made up after drinking too much mead, but chronicles from multiple sources confirm that thousands of children and adolescents, inspired by a charismatic boy preacher named either Nicholas or Stephen, depending on which account you trust, actually did march from France and Germany toward the Mediterranean, convinced that their innocence would succeed where armed knights had failed in reclaiming the Holy Land, and predictably this ended in absolute disaster, with most of the children dying from hunger, disease, or exposure, while others were supposedly sold into slavery by merchants who offered them free passage across the sea, which has to be one of the most cynical betrayals in human history, and medieval chroniclers recorded this event with varying degrees of horror and judgment, some seeing it as divine punishment for the sins of adults, others viewing it as a tragedy of misguided faith, and modern historians debate whether it was actually a movement of children, or if children was a mistranslation of pueri, which could mean either children or the poor, suggesting maybe it was a peasant uprising rather than a literal kids' crusade. But either way, thousands of vulnerable people marched off to their deaths following a charismatic leader who promised divine favor, which sounds uncomfortably familiar if you've paid any attention to history or cults or multi-level marketing schemes, so maybe we haven't evolved as much as we'd like to think, and you're definitely feeling that delicious detachment now, where your thoughts drift like leaves on a stream, going wherever the current takes them without resistance or effort. The darkness behind your eyelids is becoming a canvas for medieval scenes, and you can almost smell the torch smoke and unwashed crowds as you contemplate the Tarasque, a dragon-like creature that supposedly terrorized the people of Nerloch in Provence until Saint Martha showed up and tamed it with prayers and holy water, sprinkled it like she was house-training a particularly stubborn puppy. And while you'd think this is pure religious propaganda, the town renamed itself Tarascon after this creature and has celebrated the Tarasque festival for centuries, complete with a giant puppet that they parade through the streets, which suggests the locals took this legend very seriously indeed. And here's the fascinating part. Paleontologists have noted that the Tarasque's description, large, turtle-like shell, lion's head, scorpion's tail, resembles composite creatures that might have been inspired by fossils of actual prehistoric animals that medieval people stumbled across without the scientific framework to understand them, so they invented dragons and monsters to explain bones that didn't fit any living creature they recognized, which means medieval legends might sometimes be garbled paleontology reports, which is honestly more plausible than half the explanations you'll find on Ancient Aliens forums. Not that you're spending time there, definitely not, and as your jaw relaxes and your tongue rests gently against the roof of your mouth, you're approaching that threshold state between waking and sleeping, where everything seems simultaneously profound and ridiculous. You're aware of your heartbeat slowing down, that steady thump-thump that's been with you since before you were born, and will hopefully continue for many decades more. And in this meditative state, you're absorbing the story of the mad honey of the Black Sea region, which isn't exactly medieval but extends back to ancient times, and continued through the Middle Ages, and this was honey made by bees that fed on rhododendron flowers, creating a product that when consumed would cause hallucinations, dizziness, and sometimes death. And the Roman army under Pompey the Great lost hundreds of soldiers when they ate honey in the Black Sea region during their march, not from enemy attacks but from mad honey poisoning that left them writhing on the ground, having visions, and medieval armies kept making the same mistake because apparently military intelligence hasn't changed much in 2,000 years, and local populations knew about this honey, and sometimes even weaponized it by leaving it out for invading armies to find, turning a sweet treat into a chemical warfare agent, which is honestly pretty brilliant in a medieval sort of way. And modern hikers in Turkey still occasionally get poisoned by mad honey from roadside markets, proving that some legends remain dangerously true, even in our supposedly enlightened age of food safety regulations and ingredient labels. Your limbs are growing heavier, as if gravity has decided to get more serious about its job, and you're barely resisting the pull of sleep as you hear about the rain of fish that medieval chroniclers recorded with surprising frequency, describing days when fish literally fell from the sky, often during storms, and modern meteorologists have confirmed that waterspouts and tornadoes can indeed suck up fish from bodies of water and deposit them miles away, making it rain fish in a way that seems biblical, but is actually just atmospheric physics being weird. So when you read a medieval text claiming fish fell from heaven, You can't dismiss it as superstitious nonsense, because weather does occasionally decide to deliver seafood via airmail, which must have been absolutely terrifying if you didn't understand the mechanics involved, and probably led to a spike in church attendance and donations, because clearly the apocalypse was starting, and maybe if everyone prayed harder, God would stop throwing fish at them. Though honestly, if you're going to have precipitation, it might as well be protein-rich, and you're smiling slightly at that thought, as your face muscles finally relax into neutral. The weight of your blanket feels perfect now, distributed across your body like a gentle hug from someone who understands boundaries, and you're drifting with the knowledge that medieval people recorded lights in the sky that sound suspiciously like aurora borealis, but occurred at latitudes where auroras shouldn't appear, except that historians cross-referencing these accounts with ice core data have discovered that many of these sightings corresponded with solar storms powerful enough to push auroras much further south than normal. Meaning, when a medieval chronicle says the sky turned green and purple and people thought the world was ending, they weren't exaggerating or hallucinating. They were accurately describing a geomagnetic disturbance that modern science can verify, which means some of your ancestors watched the northern lights from Spain or Italy, or North Africa, and had no framework to understand what they were seeing except to know it was real and terrifying, beautiful all at once, much like your current state of consciousness, where thoughts and dreams are starting to blur together in ways that make perfect sense until you try to explain them later. You're barely holding on to wakefulness now, just your fingertips gripping the edge of consciousness, while the rest of you has already tumbled into that soft void, and you can almost hear medieval scribes scratching away with their quill pens, recording impossible things in permanent ink, creating documents that would survive centuries so that you could lie here in your climate-controlled bedroom with your electric lighting and indoor plumbing, and realize that humans have always been surrounded by wonders and terrors. We've just changed our vocabulary for describing them, trading dragons for extinct megafauna, and divine visions for neurological phenomena, and demon possession for mental illness. But the core experiences remain. People seeing things that shouldn't exist but do, surviving things that should kill them but don't, and recording it all for future generations who will read these accounts and wonder what was real and what was embellishment, never quite certain where the line falls, because that line has always been negotiable and always will be. And as your breathing deepens into the slow rhythm of genuine sleep, you're carrying with you the comforting thought that mystery hasn't disappeared from our world. We've just gotten slightly better at explaining it, though not as much better as we like to pretend, and the medieval legends that were shockingly true are simply reminders that reality has always been stranger than the stories we tell about it. Which means somewhere right now, something is happening that future historians will record with the same bemused certainty that medieval scribes used when they wrote, "And then the fish fell from the sky," as witnessed by many reliable persons. And you're finally letting go of that last thread of consciousness, releasing your grip on the waking world, and allowing yourself to tumble backward into sleep, where your own impossible things are waiting, personal legends that might be shockingly true or beautifully false, but are entirely yours. Either way, and the last thing you're aware of is gratitude. Gratitude for this moment of peace, for the safety of your bed, for the privilege of choosing to hear stories instead of being forced to live through them, for existing in a time when most monsters have names and explanations, even if we don't always like what those explanations reveal about us. And then even that gratitude dissolves into nothing as sleep claims you completely, wrapping you in darkness that's velvet soft and deep, and somewhere in a medieval monastery that no longer exists, a monk is carefully recording something impossible that happened yesterday, his handwriting neat despite the late hour, his candle burning low, and he has no idea that 700 years later, someone will read his words and whisper into the darkness that actually happened, before closing their eyes and dreaming of a time when the world was younger and stranger, somehow exactly the same. You're swimming up through layers of sleep now, not quite waking but shifting into a different depth, where stories can find you again, and your body has discovered that perfect position where nothing hurts and everything feels supported, that magical arrangement of pillows and blankets that you'll inevitably lose the moment you move, but for now is absolutely perfect. And in this state of floating awareness, you're ready to hear about the cadaver synod, which is possibly the most medieval thing that ever medievaled, and yes, that's a verb now. Because this story requires new grammar to contain its sheer weirdness. So picture this, it's January 897 in Rome, and Pope Stephen VI has a serious problem with his predecessor Pope Formosus, who has been dead for about 7 months, buried, decomposing, doing all the normal dead pope things, but Stephen VI is the kind of person who holds grudges beyond the grave, so he orders Formosus's corpse exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, and propped up on a throne in the Vatican for a full ecclesiastical trial, complete with a deacon standing behind the corpse and answering questions on behalf of the deceased defendant, who was literally rotting in formal wear while being cross-examined about his life choices. And this actually happened, documented in multiple sources, including writings by the Bishop of Cremona, who thought the whole thing was exactly as insane as it sounds, and the trial concluded with Formosus being found guilty posthumously, his corpse having 3 fingers cut off, the ones used for blessings, which seems particularly spiteful, and then his body was thrown into the Tiber River, because apparently proper burial was too good for a pope who couldn't even defend himself on account of being dead. And here's where it gets even more absurd. A monk supposedly retrieved the corpse from the river, and later there were reports of miracles associated with Formosus's remains, and eventually the whole trial was annulled by a later pope, who presumably had a firmer grasp on the concept of death as a statute of limitations for prosecution. But for one spectacular moment in medieval history, a dead man stood trial in the highest court of Christendom, and you're processing this information with the part of your brain that's still vaguely online. The part that's thinking medieval people were absolutely unhinged, while the rest of you is just enjoying the sensation of your mattress supporting your spine in exactly the right way. Your breathing has found that automatic rhythm again, the kind you don't think about until someone mentions it, and then suddenly you're manually operating your lungs like a character who just became aware they're in a video game. But you're letting it go back to autopilot now, because there's more story to absorb, and you're learning about Robert the Bruce's heart, which went on a better adventure than most people's entire bodies, because when Robert died in 1329, having successfully secured Scottish independence from England through a combination of warfare, diplomacy, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit, he made a deathbed request that his heart be taken on crusade to the Holy Land, since he'd never managed to go himself, being too busy fighting the English and establishing a kingdom, and generally being the kind of historical figure who gets statues erected centuries later. So his loyal friend James Douglas agreed to carry Robert's heart in a silver casket on crusade, which is simultaneously touching and deeply weird. And Douglas made it as far as Spain, where he was fighting alongside Spanish Christians against the Moors when he found himself in a desperate battle, completely surrounded, about to die. And in that moment he threw the silver casket containing his king's heart into the enemy forces, shouting something along the lines of "Lead on, brave heart, and I shall follow," which is either the most metal thing anyone has ever said, or the most dramatic, depending on your perspective. And then Douglas died in battle, and later his men retrieved both his body and the casket with Robert's heart, and the heart was brought back to Scotland and buried at Melrose Abbey, where it remained until 1996, when archaeologists actually found a lead container in the abbey that likely held the preserved heart, confirming that yes, this legendary tale of a king's heart going on crusade was shockingly true, and you're marveling at the sheer commitment of medieval friendship, while your own body is committing to staying exactly where it is, because moving seems impossibly complicated right now. The darkness in your room has quality to it now, a thickness that seems almost tangible, and you're suspended in this darkness like an astronaut floating in the gentle void of sleep, and you're hearing about the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, where French knights demonstrated that medieval military tactics were basically charge really fast and hope for the best, by refusing to follow the battle plan and instead rushing headlong into a carefully prepared Ottoman trap, because waiting around wasn't chivalric enough, and these knights, the finest warriors of France, got absolutely demolished, thousands captured, and then came the part that makes this legend gruesomely true. Sultan Bayezid I, who was apparently having a bad day, or just really believed in making examples, ordered the mass execution of prisoners, with accounts claiming anywhere from 300 to 3,000 captured knights were beheaded in front of the survivors, which seems excessive even by medieval standards of excessive, and the French nobles who could afford ransoms were spared, because medieval warfare was nothing if not transactional, and this disaster was so complete that it basically ended the Age of Crusades, not with a triumphant reclamation of holy sites, but with the flower of French chivalry bleeding out in the Balkans because they couldn't follow simple instructions, and you're contemplating the timeless human ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory through sheer stubbornness, which is a skill that apparently transcends centuries and cultures, and really should be studied more by psychologists interested in self-defeating behavior. Your muscles have achieved that perfect relaxation where they're essentially decorative, just sort of there on your skeleton like meat curtains, which is a disturbing image, but you're too relaxed to care, and you're absorbing the story of the dancing plague of 1518, which we'll get into more detail about later, but deserves mention here because it involved actual people dancing themselves to death in the streets of Strasbourg, not at a concert or a celebration, but seemingly compelled by something nobody understood. And this wasn't a legend that grew in the telling. This was documented by multiple city officials who were desperately trying to solve the problem, at first by encouraging more dancing, thinking people needed to dance it out of their systems, which is possibly the worst medical advice in history, and when that didn't work, they tried banning dancing, which also didn't work because the afflicted literally couldn't stop, and modern scholars debate whether it was mass hysteria, ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, or some kind of encephalitis, but nobody questions that it actually happened because the records are too detailed and too consistent, mentioning specific names of dancers who died from exhaustion or heart attacks or strokes, and you're grateful that the modern equivalent of unexplained compulsions mostly involves scrolling social media for hours rather than dancing until your feet bleed and your heart gives out. Though honestly, the psychological mechanism might not be that different, just the expression of it, and you're definitely too drowsy to unpack that thought any further, so you're letting it drift away like dandelion seeds on a breeze. The weight of sleep is pressing down on you now, not uncomfortable but insistent, like a cat that's decided you've been awake long enough, and it's time for everyone to settle down, and you're learning about Vlad the Impaler, who was a real historical figure named Vlad III Dracula, ruling Wallachia in the mid-1400s. And yes, he did impale thousands of people on stakes, creating literal forests of the dying that would greet invading armies and probably ruin their entire afternoon. And while stories about him might have been exaggerated by his enemies, the core facts are verified by multiple sources, including his own letters, where he boasts about his body count with the enthusiasm of a serial killer, who's also a regional administrator. And the impaling wasn't even his only hobby. He also enjoyed burning villages, boiling prisoners alive, and generally being the kind of ruler who makes Machiavelli look like a guidance counselor. But here's the thing that scholars still debate. Was he a monster or a pragmatist, dealing with impossible circumstances, fighting against the Ottoman Empire while dealing with treacherous nobility, and trying to maintain order in a region where violence was the common language of politics? And some historians argue he was actually relatively restrained by the standards of his time, which tells you everything you need to know about the standards of his time. And others point out that even medieval people thought he was excessive, so maybe don't give him too much credit for strategic brutality, but either way he was real, he did rule, he did impale enough people to earn a nickname about it, and Bram Stoker would later borrow his name for a vampire novel, which is honestly one of the gentler things to happen to Vlad's reputation, and you're considering how strange it is that a 15th century tyrant's legacy is now primarily associated with a sophisticated vampire who seduces Victorian ladies rather than with the historical reality of mass murder as administrative policy, but that's the power of good branding for you. Your thoughts are becoming non-linear now, jumping from idea to idea like a frog on lily pads, and you barely notice the transition as you hear about medieval trial by ordeal, which wasn't just a legend but was actual legal practice endorsed by the church, where accused criminals could prove their innocence by carrying red-hot iron bars, walking over burning coals, or plunging their hands into boiling water, and if their wounds healed cleanly within 3 days, that was proof of God's favor, and they were innocent, which is either a brilliant way to let God handle jury duty, or a terrible way to approach criminal justice, depending on your perspective. Probably the latter though, and archaeologists have found evidence that some priests actually rigged these ordeals by using blessed water that was merely warm rather than boiling, essentially acquitting defendants through holy trickery, which means even medieval clergy recognized that maybe burning people to determine guilt was problematic, but the practice continued for centuries until the Fourth Lateran Council finally banned clergy participation in ordeals in 1215, forcing legal systems to develop actual evidence-based jurisprudence, though trial by combat remained an option in many places, well into the modern era, because apparently hitting each other with swords was considered a more reliable path to truth than torture by temperature. And honestly, that's not the worst reasoning. At least combat requires some skill rather than just having heat-resistant genetics, and you're definitely too far gone into sleepiness to properly analyze medieval legal theory, so you're just accepting it as another weird fact to file away in the cabinet of things that actually happened but shouldn't have. The room temperature is perfect, that Goldilocks zone where you're neither hot nor cold but exactly comfortable. And you're hearing about the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who died in 1197, possibly from malaria or possibly from poison. Historians still argue about this, but his body was being transported for burial when it began to smell so bad that the funeral procession had to stop multiple times for clergy to essentially Febreze the corpse with incense and prayers, and they decided to remove his internal organs and bury them separately, which was common practice for important dead people who needed to travel. You'd bury the squishy bits that rotted fast and preserve the rest with spices and wine, essentially pickling your emperor for the journey home. And Henry's organs were buried in a cathedral in Sicily, while the rest of him continued north. And this detail matters because it's verified by multiple sources and shows that medieval people had a very practical approach to decomposition. They couldn't stop it, but they could manage it, compartmentalize it, literally. And the legend of powerful people being buried in multiple locations is true. Their bodies scattered across kingdoms like some kind of morbid scavenger hunt. And modern medical anthropologists studying these remains have confirmed the preservation methods worked surprisingly well, finding evidence of the spices and wine used to preserve flesh, making medieval embalming less legendary and more recipe-based. Follow these steps and your emperor will keep for up to 3 months. Results may vary, and you're wondering if there's a medieval cookbook somewhere with a section on preserving royalty, right between the recipes for peacock and mead, which seems entirely possible knowing medieval priorities. Your heartbeat is so slow now, distant and calm like waves on a far shore, and you're drifting with the knowledge that Pope Benedict IX, who served 3 different terms as Pope in the mid-11th century, was so young when first elected that some sources claim he was only 11 or 12 years old, making him literally a child pope, which even in the anything-goes world of medieval papal politics was considered excessive, and his behavior as pope included throwing orgies in the Lateran Palace, because apparently someone thought giving unlimited power to a preteen would work out fine. Narrator voice: it did not, and Benedict sold the papacy to his godfather for £1,000 of gold when he wanted to get married, which is both simpler and more corrupt than most papal transitions, and later tried to take the position back by force, leading to a situation where there were briefly 3 different men claiming to be pope simultaneously, which must have been confusing for Catholics trying to figure out whose indulgences were valid, and eventually Benedict was excommunicated and disappeared from history, possibly living as a hermit doing penance for being the worst pope ever. A competitive category to be sure, and the fact that this entire chaotic papacy is documented in church records makes it shockingly true rather than anti-Catholic propaganda. Just a genuine historical moment when the church decided, you know what, let's put a kid in charge of Christianity. What could go wrong? And then found out in vivid detail, and you're smiling in your half-sleep because humans have always been capable of spectacular bad decisions regardless of how seriously they take their institutions. You're barely aware of your physical body now, just a consciousness floating in darkness and absorbing stories like a sponge absorbs water, and you're learning about the Children's Crusade participant we mentioned earlier, which some scholars now believe was actually confused with the Shepherd's Crusade of 1251, a movement of peasants who were definitely not children, but were described using terms that later translators interpreted as meaning young people, and these peasants marched toward the Holy Land, but actually just ended up attacking Jewish communities in France before being suppressed by authorities, showing how religious fervor could be twisted into violence against the closest available target rather than the stated enemy. And this confusion between different crusades and different time periods shows how legends accumulate errors like snowballs rolling downhill, each retelling adding new details or losing old ones, until the core truth is wrapped in so many layers of interpretation that scholars spend entire careers trying to unwrap it, which is job security if nothing else. And the shocking truth isn't always that the legend happened exactly as told, but that something real and often terrible inspired the legend, and untangling what actually occurred from what people wanted to believe occurred is the endless work of historical inquiry, and you're participating in that work right now, just by listening, by holding space for complexity and ambiguity, by accepting that medieval legends can be simultaneously true and false depending on which part you're examining. And that's okay. That's actually more interesting than if everything were simply verifiable or simply false. The truth that lives in the space between certainty and fiction is where humans actually exist, where we've always existed, making meaning out of events we only partly understand, and as sleep finally claims the last holdouts of your consciousness, You're content with this ambiguity, comfortable with mystery, and ready to let the next section of stories find you in an even deeper layer of rest, where the boundary between hearing and dreaming becomes so thin, it might as well not exist, and you're sinking down into that velvet dark where medieval kings still preside over trials of the dead, and hearts travel in silver caskets and popes sell their offices for gold, and it all really happened, every shocking, impossible bit of it. You're deeper now, in that layer of sleep where external sounds occasionally filter through, but get immediately woven into dream logic, where the sound of a car passing becomes a medieval cart on cobblestones, and your breathing is so slow and deep that if someone were watching they'd probably check to make sure you were okay, and in this profound rest you're ready to hear about the relic trade of medieval Europe, which was basically the ultimate collectibles market, except instead of trading baseball cards, people were buying and selling fingers, toes, teeth, bones, and splinters, supposedly from saints, martyrs, and even Jesus himself. And the market was so lucrative that entrepreneurial types weren't above manufacturing relics to meet demand, which means medieval Europe was flooded with enough splinters of the true cross to build several large ships, enough nails from the crucifixion to open a hardware store, and enough milk from the Virgin Mary to supply a dairy farm, because nothing says religious devotion like rampant fraud in the service of pilgrimage tourism, and you're contemplating this while your body maintains its absolutely perfect position, not moving a single muscle, because moving would require effort, and effort would require consciousness, and you're working very hard at not having any of that right now. The darkness has texture now, almost like velvet brushing against your closed eyelids, and you're absorbing the story of the Holy Precuse, which is exactly what it sounds like, the alleged foreskin of Jesus Christ removed during his circumcision, and somehow preserved for over 1,000 years, and no fewer than 18 different European churches claim to possess this particular relic, which raises obvious mathematical questions about how many foreskins one person can have. The answer being one, unless your divine or medieval relic collectors are less honest than they appear, probably the latter, and these holy foreskins were treated with the utmost reverence, displayed in ornate reliquaries, credited with performing miracles, and attracting pilgrims by the thousands who would travel for weeks to catch a glimpse of sacred prepuce. And yes, this is uncomfortable to think about, but also absolutely documented in church records, with various popes over the centuries trying to navigate the delicate question of which, if any, of these foreskins was authentic, without wanting to focus too much attention on the topic. Because even medieval theologians recognized this was weird, and the veneration of the holy prepuce continued into the modern era, only being quietly discouraged by the Vatican in the 20th century, proving that sometimes legends persist through sheer institutional inertia, and nobody wanting to be the person who stands up and says, hey, maybe we should stop venerating this, and you're definitely too relaxed to feel more than mild amusement at this particular quirk of medieval Christianity, filing it alongside all the other strange expressions of faith that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, but look absolutely wild in retrospect. Your muscles have achieved what scientists would probably call optimum relaxation state, but what you're experiencing is simply not having muscles anymore, just a comfortable arrangement of relaxed tissue that used to be capable of movement, and you're learning about the Shroud of Turin, which remains one of the most famous and controversial relics in Christianity, a linen cloth bearing the image of a man that believers claim is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. And here's where legend meets uncomfortable science. The shroud first appeared in the historical record in the 1350s, owned by a French knight who never explained where he got it, and his family's local bishop investigated and concluded it was a painted forgery, writing letters to the Pope about it with the kind of exasperation that suggests he'd dealt with relic fraud before. But the shroud survived these accusations, and eventually ended up in Turin, Italy, where it became one of the most studied artifacts in history, subjected to radiocarbon dating in 1988, which concluded the cloth dated to between 1260 and 1390, firmly medieval rather than ancient. But shroud believers questioned the dating methodology, suggested the sample was contaminated, proposed the image was created by some kind of energy burst during resurrection, essentially creating an entire field of syndenology, or shroud studies, that continues to this day. And the debate over the shroud's authenticity shows how legends can persist despite, or perhaps because of scientific investigation, how faith and evidence can look at the same object and see completely different truths, and scholars remain divided on whether the shroud is a remarkable medieval artwork, a genuine 1st century burial cloth that somehow got misdated, or the world's most successful tourist attraction, generating millions in pilgrim revenue regardless of its actual origins, and you're too drowsy to adjudicate this centuries-old controversy. But you're content, knowing that some mysteries remain mysteries even when science weighs in, which is either frustrating or comforting depending on your personality and relationship with ambiguity. The air in your room has gone still, that perfect quiet that comes late at night, when even the ambient sounds of modern life have mostly ceased, and you're hearing about the head of John the Baptist, which, like the Holy Prepuce, suffered from an overabundance problem, because at least 6 different churches across Europe and the Middle East claim to possess the original head, which would be impressive if John had been a hydra, but since he was a regular human with the standard one-head configuration, this presented logical difficulties that medieval believers solved through impressive mental gymnastics, suggesting that maybe some heads were from different stages of John's life, like a baby tooth versus adult tooth situation, but with heads, which doesn't really work biologically, but gets points for creativity, and modern archaeologists have actually tested several of these supposed John the Baptist heads, including one in Bulgaria, that carbon dating suggests could actually date to the right time period and might belong to a Middle Eastern man from around the 1st century, making it remotely possible, though hardly proven, that this particular head could theoretically be genuine, and this finding was published in peer-reviewed journals and immediately seized upon by believers as proof. While skeptics pointed out that lots of people died in the Middle East in the 1st century, and finding one from the right time period doesn't mean you've found the right person from that time period, and the debate continues in academic journals, with a level of seriousness that would probably surprise John the Baptist, who presumably didn't think his head would become a collectible item disputed by scholars with carbon dating equipment 2,000 years after his execution. But here we are, and you're floating through this story like a leaf on a stream, not particularly concerned with resolution, because sleep has softened all your needs for concrete answers. Your body temperature has reached that perfect equilibrium with your environment, not generating excess heat, not losing too much, just existing in thermal balance that feels like being held by invisible hands that know exactly what you need, and you're absorbing the tale of Charlemagne's arm, which was separated from his body after his death in 814, and encased in a golden reliquary shaped like an arm, because medieval people believed that sacred body parts should be stored in containers that looked like the body parts, which is either helpful organization or slightly disturbing depending on your perspective. And this arm-shaped arm container became one of the most powerful relics in France, used in coronation ceremonies and credited with military victories, and it still exists today in a cathedral treasury, and scientists who studied it confirmed the bones inside do appear to be from a tall man who died around the right time period to be Charlemagne, making this one of the more plausibly authentic relics, though there's still debate about whether medieval relic makers would have bothered to source appropriately aged bones, or would have just grabbed whatever was handy. And the arm's journey through history includes being hidden during the French Revolution, when revolutionaries were melting down church treasures, then being rediscovered and restored, surviving wars and regime changes and shifts in religious practice, and now it sits in a museum case where tourists can photograph it. And there's something both sad and remarkable about that trajectory, from the arm of an emperor who united much of Europe to a museum exhibit that people mostly scroll past on their phones while looking for the gift shop. But the arm endures, still bearing silent witness to the faith and fraud and genuine wonder of the medieval world, and you're too deep in relaxation to feel strongly about any of this, but you're registering it in that way. You register things when you're almost asleep, filing it away in memory with soft edges and gentle light. The weight of your blankets feels like the most natural thing in the world now, not an object you're under, but an extension of your own desire for comfort and security. And you're learning about the Veronica's veil, a cloth that supposedly bore the image of Christ's face, after Saint Veronica used it to wipe his face on the road to Calvary. And this relic was one of the most important in medieval Rome, displayed at St. Peter's Basilica and attracting pilgrims from across Europe who would travel for months to see it. And the legend says that whoever looked upon the veil would be protected from sudden death that day, which is a pretty good incentive for regular viewing if you're worried about mortality. And the veil was famous enough to appear in Dante's Divine Comedy and in countless medieval artworks. But here's where the story gets complicated. The original veil disappeared or was destroyed at some point. Different sources blame different catastrophes, and what's shown to pilgrims today may or may not be the same object, and several other churches claim to have the real veil, and scholars debate whether the entire story was invented to compete with similar relic legends from other cities, and the image on the veil has been variously described as clear and detailed or barely visible depending on who's looking and when, which suggests either miraculous fluctuation or more mundane issues of textile degradation and wishful thinking. And despite or because of all this uncertainty, the veil legend remains powerful, appearing in modern films and books, shaping artistic depictions of Christ, and showing how a possibly fictional relic can have very real effects on culture and faith. And you're experiencing this story as a warm sensation spreading from your chest to your extremities, not quite thinking about it anymore, but letting it settle into your drowsy consciousness like sediment in still water. Your jaw has completely relaxed, your tongue sitting comfortably in your mouth without any tension, and you're hearing about the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which King Louis XIII built specifically to house his collection of Passion relics, including what he believed was Christ's crown of thorns, several thorns from the crown, a piece of the true cross, the holy lance that pierced Christ's side, and various other items that he purchased for absolutely staggering sums of money, essentially spending more on relics than on the spectacular chapel he built to house them. And Louis was later canonized as Saint Louis, partly for his crusading efforts but also for his piety demonstrated through relic collecting, which shows how spending enormous amounts of money on religious items could boost your reputation in medieval society. And modern scholars studying the relics Louis collected have found that many are consistent with 1st century Palestinian materials, though that doesn't prove they're what they claim to be, just that whoever made or sold them used historically appropriate materials, which actually suggests sophisticated fraud rather than proving authenticity, because why would a forger use incorrect materials when correct ones would sell better? And some of these relics survived the French Revolution, while others were lost, and the crown of thorns is now in Notre Dame Cathedral, having survived the 2019 fire, in one of those moments where even skeptics pause and wonder, and the crown remains an object of veneration and controversy. And you're too deep in relaxation to investigate further, but you're aware that the line between authentic ancient artifact and medieval fabrication may be thinner and less important than either believers or skeptics want to admit, because the cultural power of these objects exists regardless of their provenance, and their ability to inspire devotion or art or architecture or pilgrimages is real, even if the objects themselves are not what they claim to be. And that tension between material authenticity and spiritual truth is something medieval people understood better than we might think. They knew fraud existed, they just didn't always care if the fraud served a higher purpose. And maybe that's not the worst approach to objects of faith. Maybe the transformation they work on believers matters more than their molecular composition. And you're definitely too drowsy to unpack the theology or philosophy here, but you're comfortable letting these questions hang unanswered in your mind like stars in a cloudy sky. The sound of your own breathing has become almost meditative, that soft rhythm that could lull anyone to sleep, and you're learning about the holy blood of Bruges, a relic that supposedly contains cloth stained with Christ's blood, brought to Belgium by a Crusader count in the 12th century, and housed in an ornate basilica, and this relic is carried through the streets of Bruges every year in a procession that dates back centuries, and chemical analysis of the cloth has revealed that it does contain blood, human blood in fact, but whether that blood is 2,000 years old or somewhat more recent is something scientists debate, because blood deteriorates in predictable ways, but preservation methods can complicate dating, and the blood type has been tested and found to be AB, which some believers point to as significant, because the Shroud of Turin's bloodstains are also supposedly AB type, suggesting consistency across relics, while skeptics note that AB is rare enough to be exotic but common enough that it wouldn't be hard to source, making it perfect for relic makers wanting to create something distinctive but plausible. And the holy blood of Bruges continues to be venerated by thousands of believers every year, regardless of what scientists say about its authenticity, showing that faith and evidence operate in different spheres and don't always need to reconcile. And you're aware of this debate in the way you're aware of distant music, hearing it but not really listening, processing it but not judging, just letting it exist as another data point in the vast strange story of how humans relate to the sacred and the historical. Your entire body has achieved weightlessness now, or at least that's what it feels like, as if you're floating an inch above your mattress held aloft by the gentlest possible anti-gravity, and you're hearing about Saint Catherine of Siena's head, which is preserved in Siena, while various other parts of her are distributed across Italy, because medieval people really loved dividing saints into shareable portions, and Catherine was a mystic and axpigmatic and political force, who convinced the Pope to return from Avignon to Rome, And she was canonized 40 years after her death in 1380, and her head has been displayed in a reliquary ever since. And modern forensic examination has confirmed the head does belong to a woman who lived in the 14th century, and matches historical descriptions of Catherine, making this one of the more authenticated relics. And you can actually visit the head today if you're in Siena, and want to gaze upon the remarkably preserved face of a medieval mystic who once told the Pope what to do, and he listened. And there's something powerful about that continuity, that this woman's physical remains are still present, still drawing pilgrims, still connecting modern believers to medieval faith. And whatever you think about relic veneration as a practice, you have to acknowledge the historical preservation involved, because these objects have been protected and maintained for centuries, surviving wars and plagues and revolutions, and that maintenance represents an unbroken chain of human care and attention, people throughout history deciding this matters, this should be preserved. Future generations should have access to this connection with the past, and you're too relaxed to feel more than gentle appreciation for that multi-generational commitment to preservation, even as you recognize the complex motivations involved. Because nothing human is ever simple, and medieval relic culture wasn't simple either. It was a mix of devotion and commerce, faith and fraud, genuine mysticism and clever marketing, and trying to separate those strands is probably impossible, probably beside the point, because it all happened together, and you're sinking further into sleep, feeling the last threads of active thought dissolving like sugar in warm water, becoming part of the solution rather than distinct granules. And somewhere in a cathedral in France a golden arm waits behind glass, and somewhere in Italy a saint's head rests in its reliquary, and somewhere in your drowsy mind these images drift like boats on a calm sea, and you're ready to let go completely, to stop analyzing or questioning, or even listening very actively, to just exist in this state of profound rest where stories wash over you like gentle waves, and the medieval world with all its contradictions and impossibilities and shocking truths is just another lullaby, now just another reason to let your conscious mind take a break, and you're grateful for that, grateful for this journey through sacred frauds and holy truths, and all the beautiful ambiguous territory between, and you're releasing your grip on awareness, one finger at a time, until finally there's nothing left to hold on to, and you're falling, slowly falling, into deeper rest. You're barely here anymore, just a whisper of consciousness floating in the vast dark, and the stories are finding you in this deep place where they become almost like memories, as if you're remembering rather than hearing for the first time, and you're ready to learn about the lambton worm, a serpent or dragon that terrorized northern England in medieval times. According to local legend, supposedly caught as a tiny worm by a young heir who threw it down a well while skipping church, because of course it involves someone skipping church. That's medieval storytelling 101, and the worm grew and grew in the well, until it was enormous and escaped to terrorize the countryside, wrapping itself around hills, eating livestock and possibly people, becoming such a problem that the heir, now an adult knight returned from crusades, had to fight it in special armor covered in blades, which is actually a clever solution if you're fighting something that kills by constriction. Turn yourself into a cheese grater and let the enemy defeat itself by squeezing. And the knight killed the worm, but violated a promise he'd made to a witch about the terms of victory, cursing his family for 9 generations, because witches are big on contract enforcement. And this all sounds like pure fantasy, except that there are geological features in northern England still called Worm Hill, and similar names, and local tradition has maintained this story with remarkable consistency for centuries. And some folklorists suggest the legend might preserve memory of a real predator, possibly a large snake or crocodile, that somehow ended up in medieval England, or it could be a garbled memory of a Roman military campaign, because worm is linguistically related to vermin, and could have described foreign invaders rather than a literal serpent, and nobody knows for sure, which means the shocking truth might be historical rather than zoological. But either way, something happened in medieval Northumberland that was significant enough to generate this persistent legend, and you're absorbing this with the part of your mind that's still peripherally online, while the rest of you is busy being comfortable and still. Your breathing has become so subtle that if you were wearing a mirror under your nose, it would barely fog, just the gentlest exchange of air that keeps your body running on minimum power. And you're learning about the lindworm, a serpentine creature from Scandinavian and Germanic folklore that supposedly infested various regions during medieval times, described as having a serpent's body and sometimes dragon features, and chronicles mention actual attempts to kill these creatures, including one account from 14th century Sweden about a lindworm that was terrorizing a region until it was killed by a man named Peder Gult, which sounds made up, but is recorded in local church records with the same matter-of-fact tone used for recording marriages and property transfers, just. And also Peder killed the lindworm, like it's a normal Tuesday achievement, and modern cryptozoologists love these accounts and try to suggest they prove dinosaurs survived into medieval times, which is almost certainly not what happened, but the legends might preserve encounters with large snakes or eels or other animals that seemed monstrous to medieval farmers who weren't expecting them. Because even a very large eel looks pretty dragon adjacent if you're not familiar with marine biology, and you're finding it in your cow pasture, and the persistence of dragon legends across multiple cultures suggests they're tapping into something either universally psychological, like an archetypal fear of serpents and predators, or universally experiential, like encounters with fossils or large reptiles, and scholars are still debating which explanation better fits the evidence, with most agreeing it's probably a combination of factors, because most interesting historical questions resist simple answers, and you're too far into sleep to care much about academic debates, but you're enjoying the images of medieval farmers wielding pitchforks against confused eels, because that feels like a very human response to the unexpected. Just grab a farming implement and hope for the best. The room around you has ceased to exist in any meaningful way. You're barely aware of having a body, much less of that body being in a specific location, and you're hearing about the cockatrice, a legendary creature supposedly hatched from a rooster's egg by a toad or serpent, having the power to kill with its gaze or breath, and medieval bestiaries treated this as a real animal that you might encounter if you were unlucky, offering advice on how to defeat one, primarily by showing it a mirror so it would kill itself with its own deadly gaze, which is either brilliant problem solving or the medieval equivalent of have you tried turning it off and on again, and church architecture sometimes included cockatrice imagery, in the same way it included imagery of real animals, not distinguishing between lions and cockatrices in terms of ontological status. They were all just creatures that existed in the wide world, some you'd seen and some you hadn't, but all equally real in the medieval conception of natural history, and this tells us something important about medieval epistemology, about how people decided what was real, because they didn't have the sharp categories we use now, the binary of exists or doesn't. They had a more fluid sense of reality, where things could be rarely seen but still real, or real in some places but not others, or real in the past but not now, and you're experiencing this more fluid reality right now, in your dream-adjacent state, where categories are soft and everything blends together, where the cockatrice and the cow are equally present and equally distant, both occupying the same ontological space in your drowsy consciousness. Your heart is beating so slowly and steadily that it's barely noticeable, just doing its job without any fanfare, and you're learning about the Vorvra, a French dragon or serpent that supposedly guarded treasures and had a precious stone embedded in its forehead, and people who saw the Vorvra could claim its treasure if they could distract it or steal its stone, and various medieval French texts mention the Vorvra as if it's common knowledge, just another hazard of rural life along with wolves and bandits and bad harvests, and the legend might have originated from sightings of comets or falling stars that seemed to land in specific locations, making treasure seekers dig in those spots, or from finding ancient burial mounds that contained actual treasures left by Bronze Age or Iron Age peoples, and encountering those treasures without archaeological context. Medieval people invented guardians to explain why the treasure was there and why it was hidden, because humans are story-making creatures, and we'd rather have a dragon explanation than no explanation. And the Vorvra legend was functional. It kept people from disturbing graves and sacred sites. It created a supernatural penalty for greed, and whether the Vorvra actually existed in some zoological sense is less interesting than the fact that believing it existed shaped behavior and reinforced social norms. And you're barely processing this anymore, just letting the words wash over you like warm water, not analyzing, not judging, just existing in the presence of these old stories that served purposes you don't need to fully understand. The darkness has depth now, layers upon layers, and you're sinking through them one at a time, and you're hearing about the dancing plague of 1518 again, but in more detail this time, because it deserves attention. This event where in Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, a woman named Frau Trophea began dancing in the street, and couldn't stop, and within days, dozens more joined her, and within a month, 400 people were dancing uncontrollably, many of them until they collapsed from exhaustion, or died from heart attacks or strokes, and the city council consulted physicians, who diagnosed it as hot blood, and prescribed more dancing as a cure, which led to the city hiring musicians and opening guild halls specifically for the afflicted to dance in, essentially creating a medieval rave, but one where attendance was involuntary, and the music wouldn't stop, and people were literally dancing themselves to death, and only after several people died did authority decide maybe encouraging the dancing was counterproductive, and they banned public dancing and music, and eventually the plague ended, whether because of the ban or because the psychological contagion had run its course. Nobody knows, and modern theories range from ergot poisoning, which is a fungus that grows on grain and causes convulsions and hallucinations, to mass psychogenic illness, which is a fancy term for everybody freaked out together and their bodies manifested the freakout as uncontrollable dancing, and scholars debate whether it was ergotism or collective hysteria, or some combination. But nobody doubts that it happened because the city records are explicit, listing names of the dancers, dates of their dancing and causes of death, and you're contemplating how the human body can betray you in ways that seem impossible, how psychological stress can manifest as physical symptoms that are very real, even if their origin isn't physical, and the dancing plague shows that whatever we think we know about mind-body connections, medieval people experience something we still can't fully explain, and that's humbling, and you're too tired to be properly humbled, but you're aware of the feeling somewhere in the back of your drowsy consciousness. Your body has achieved complete stillness, not a single voluntary movement happening, just the automatic processes keeping you alive while you rest. And you're learning about tarantism, a related phenomenon from southern Italy, where people believed they'd been bitten by tarantula spiders, and the only cure was to dance frantically until the poison worked its way out of their system. And this happened frequently enough that specific music called tarantella evolved specifically for this purpose, upbeat frantic music to help the bitten dance out their affliction, and communities would gather to play music for the afflicted, who would dance for hours or even days. And modern researchers have determined that tarantula bites, while painful, don't cause the symptoms associated with tarantism, which were more like panic attacks and hysteria, suggesting tarantism was a culturally sanctioned way to express psychological distress through physical movement, essentially a socially acceptable breakdown that looked like dancing and had a clear prescribed cure. And the music was real, the dancing was real, the suffering was real, but the spider bite explanation was metaphorical or misunderstood, and this persisted into the 20th century in some rural Italian communities, showing how a medieval legend of venomous spiders causing dance mania became a self-reinforcing cultural phenomenon that lasted centuries, and the line between what's physically real and what's culturally constructed gets very blurry when you look closely at phenomena like this, and you're too deep in relaxation to untangle it further. But you're aware that truth is complicated, more complicated than simple categories of real versus fake allow for, and medieval people knew this in their own way. They just used different language to describe it. The weight pressing down on you now isn't your blanket anymore, but sleep itself, heavy and irresistible, and you're hearing about Saint Vitus's dance, another name for dancing mania that occurred in various places throughout the Middle Ages, named after Saint Vitus, who was supposedly martyred in the 4th century, and became the patron saint of people afflicted with dancing disorders, and medieval people would make pilgrimages to shrines of Saint Vitus, hoping for cures, and sometimes mass dancing would break out at these pilgrimage sites, either because people were already predisposed to dancing mania, or because the power of suggestion and crowd psychology would trigger episodes, and this created a feedback loop where the cure and the disease became entangled. And modern neurologists have suggested that some cases of what medieval people called Saint Vitus's dance might have been Sydenham's chorea, which is an actual neurological condition that causes involuntary movements and can occur after strep infections, which were common in medieval Europe. So maybe some of these dancing plagues had both psychological and physiological components. Maybe people with actual movement disorders triggered imitative behaviors in others through mass hysteria. Maybe it's all connected in ways we still don't fully understand. And the shocking truth is that we still see mass psychogenic illness today. It just manifests differently, through different symptoms that make sense in our cultural context. Like groups of students developing mysterious twitches, or girls in Leroy, New York in 2011, developing Tourette's-like symptoms that spread through their school, with no identifiable physical cause. And this shows that whatever caused medieval dancing plagues wasn't unique to medieval brains. It's something human brains can do under the right conditions of stress and suggestion and social reinforcement, and you're barely conscious enough to register this parallel, but it's settling into your mind anyway, becoming part of the dreamscape that's forming behind your closed eyes. Your consciousness is flickering now like a candle in the wind, present for moments then gone, then present again, and you're learning about the werewolf trials of medieval Europe, because yes, those were real. Courts actually prosecuted people for being werewolves, and these weren't metaphorical charges, they were literal accusations of shape-shifting into wolves and eating people, and trials included testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen the transformations, and the accused sometimes confessed under torture, or genuinely believed they had transformed, possibly because of mental illness, or because of ergot poisoning again. That fungus gets blamed for a lot of medieval weirdness, and probably deserves it. And some werewolf legends might have been attempts to explain serial killers before that concept existed, because if someone is killing people with unusual savagery, saying they turn into a wolf makes as much sense as any other pre-modern explanation. And the werewolf trials peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, which is technically early modern rather than medieval, but close enough, and hundreds of people were executed for lycanthropy across Europe, and the trial records survive in archives, documenting the testimonies and confessions and sentences, making this another legend that's shockingly true. Not because werewolves existed, but because people genuinely believed they existed and acted on that belief with legal and lethal consequences. And the boundary between the real crime and the supernatural explanation got collapsed in medieval jurisprudence in ways that seem bizarre now, but made sense in a world where the supernatural and natural weren't separate categories, and you're too deeply relaxed to feel the horror of these wrongful executions. But you're aware that medieval legends often have tragic human costs, that the shocking truth includes shocking injustice, and that believing impossible things can have very real and very terrible effects on real people. And somewhere in your drowsy mind, you're holding space for the victims of these trials. People who died because of stories, because of mass belief in things that weren't real, and that feels important to honor, even if you're barely conscious, even if you're mostly asleep, because bearing witness matters, remembering matters, even in this liminal space between waking and dreaming. Your body is indistinguishable from the bed now. You've melted into the mattress, become one with the sheets and pillows, and you're learning about the green children of Woolpit, who appeared in Suffolk, England, sometime in the 12th century. According to multiple chroniclers, 2 children with green-tinged skin, who spoke an unknown language, and would only eat beans at first, and they were taken in by a local landowner, and gradually the green color faded, and they learned English. But the girl who survived while her brother died told a story about coming from a land where the sun never shone, and everything was in twilight. And modern scholars have proposed explanations ranging from Flemish orphans who ate only broad beans causing their green skin color, to children suffering from hyperchromic anemia, to straightforward folklore that got mistaken for history, but multiple medieval chroniclers recorded this story as fact, treating it as a genuine mystery rather than a fable, and whether the green children actually existed or not. Medieval people believed they did, and tried to explain them, and the green children became one of those legends that seems too specific and weird to be completely fabricated, but too impossible to be completely true. And they exist in that strange territory where history and folklore overlap, and you're experiencing them now, not as a historical puzzle to solve, but as images in your drowsy mind. Green children emerging from another world, looking around at the brightness and the strangeness, and maybe that's what we all are, strange children from somewhere else, trying to make sense of the overwhelming brightness of existence. And that thought is profound and silly in equal measure, which feels appropriate for your current state of consciousness, and you're barely here anymore, barely thinking, just drifting with the green children through twilight lands that might have existed or might have been dreamed into being by medieval chroniclers who needed a good story, and either way is fine. Either way, you're grateful for the story, grateful for the mystery, grateful for another reason to let go of consciousness and sink deeper into the velvet void of sleep, and you're releasing, until there's almost nothing left of you that's awake, just the smallest spark of awareness bearing witness to these impossible medieval truths, these legends that shocked historians by being documented, verified, undeniable, and as that last spark begins to fade, you're content with mystery, content with ambiguity, content with the shocking truth that the world has always been stranger than we imagine, and probably you're almost entirely gone now, just a trace of consciousness remaining like the last star visible before dawn, and even that's fading as you drift in the deepest layer of pre-sleep, where stories become experiences, and experiences become dreams, and in this profound darkness, you're hearing about the ghosts of medieval castles, because of course medieval castles are haunted. They've had centuries to accumulate tragedies and legends, and the line between historical events and hauntings gets especially blurry when you're dealing with buildings that have witnessed so much death and suffering, and your breathing is barely perceptible now, just the softest exchange of air, and you're learning about the Tower of London, which is basically a greatest hits collection of medieval horror, built by William the Conqueror, and used as a royal palace, prison, torture chamber, and execution site for nearly 1,000 years. And the list of people who died violently there reads like a who's who of English history: Anne Boleyn beheaded, Lady Jane Grey beheaded, the princes in the Tower possibly murdered, countless others tortured and killed in ways that don't bear thinking about. And the ghost stories started almost immediately, guards and residents reporting apparitions, strange sounds, unexplained phenomena, and these reports continue to the present day, documented by yeoman warders and visitors. And whether you believe in ghosts or not, the Tower of London has an atmosphere that's undeniable. Walking through those corridors, you feel the weight of history, and some of that weight might be psychological, your brain responding to knowledge of what happened there. But some guards have reported seeing things with no prior knowledge of what they were seeing, describing figures that match historical personages they didn't know about, and scholars debate whether these are genuine paranormal phenomena, or just pattern recognition errors and suggestion, but the reports are consistent enough and detailed enough that they can't be dismissed as simple fabrication. Something is happening there, even if what's happening isn't technically ghosts in the supernatural sense, and you're too deep in relaxation to adjudicate between explanations. You're just absorbing the images of medieval spirits walking ancient corridors, still trapped in the moments of their deaths, still replaying their tragedies, and whether that's literally true or metaphorically true, it feels true, and that's what matters in this liminal space where you're mostly asleep. Your heartbeat is distant now, like hearing thunder from far away, and you're learning about the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall, a ghost whose photograph was supposedly taken in 1936, showing a misty figure descending a staircase, and this photograph was published in Country Life magazine, and analyzed extensively, and while skeptics suggest it was a double exposure or deliberate hoax, believers point out that the photographers had no apparent motive to fake it, and seemed genuinely shaken by what they captured. And the Brown Lady is supposedly the ghost of Lady Dorothy Walpole, who was locked in Raynham Hall by her husband in the 1720s after he discovered her affair, and she died there either from illness or possibly from being pushed down the stairs. Historical records aren't clear, but sightings of a woman in brown roaming the hall and appearing on that particular staircase date back centuries, long before the famous photograph, and multiple witnesses who knew nothing about the legend have reported seeing her, describing the same brown dress and the same area of the house, and this is one of those cases where the legend has so much documentation behind it that dismissing it entirely feels intellectually lazy, but accepting it as proof of an afterlife also requires abandoning the scientific worldview most of us operate from, so you're left in this uncomfortable middle ground where something unexplained is happening, but the explanation remains elusive, and scholars continue to debate what the Brown Lady represents: literal ghost, psychological phenomenon, misidentified natural occurrence, or some combination thereof, and you're too drowsy to care which explanation wins. You're just drifting with the Brown Lady through empty corridors, watching her eternal descent down stairs that lead nowhere, stuck in a loop of her own tragedy, and that image is fading into your forming dreams, becoming part of the landscape of your unconscious mind. The room temperature feels perfect, the darkness feels complete, and you're hearing about Leap Castle in Ireland, often called the most haunted castle in the world, and if you know its history you understand why, because this place has been a site of violence since the 13th century. Clan battles, family murders, a chapel where a priest was stabbed by his brother during Mass, and in the 1900s during renovations workers discovered an oubliette, which is a dungeon with a one-way drop, essentially a hole you throw prisoners into and forget about them. And this particular oubliette was full of skeletons, so many human remains that it took workers 3 cartloads to remove them all. And the ghost stories from Leap Castle are extensive and disturbing, visitors reporting feelings of being watched, touched, pushed, experiencing overwhelming dread in certain rooms, and the most famous entity is the elemental, described as a smell first, like rotting flesh and sulfur, followed by a feeling of malevolent presence, and multiple witnesses over decades have reported identical experiences in the same locations within the castle. And skeptics point out that old castles are drafty and full of spots where air currents and acoustics create weird effects, and knowledge of the castle's violent history primes visitors to interpret ambiguous sensations as supernatural. But even skeptical investigators have reported feeling unusually uncomfortable in specific areas, and the sheer consistency of reports across time and across witnesses who have no contact with each other suggests something more than simple suggestion, maybe not ghosts in the traditional sense, but some kind of environmental or psychological phenomenon we don't fully understand, place memory or trauma imprints, or something else that science hasn't adequately explained, and you're barely present enough to register this mystery, but it's settling into your consciousness like sediment, becoming part of the deep structure of your sleeping mind. Your muscles have forgotten how to move, your body has forgotten how to be anything other than still, and you're learning about Edinburgh Castle, built on an extinct volcanic rock and occupied continuously for over 1,000 years, and it has predictably collected ghost stories, the way old buildings collect dust, stories of a headless drummer, whose appearance supposedly foretells disaster for the castle, of French prisoners from the 7 Years' War, whose tortured spirits still linger in the vaults, of a phantom bagpiper, who vanished while exploring tunnels beneath the castle, and whose music can allegedly still be heard underground. And Edinburgh conducted a formal paranormal investigation in 2001, bringing in scientists and volunteers who had no knowledge of the castle's haunted reputation, asking them to report any unusual experiences, and a statistically significant number of participants reported anomalous experiences in the areas traditionally associated with haunting, even though they didn't know which areas those were, suggesting that something about those spaces affects people in consistent ways, whether that's genuine paranormal activity, or just unusual electromagnetic fields or acoustic properties that create feelings of unease. Nobody knows for certain, but the correlation between historically haunted spaces and spaces that affect visitors in measurable ways is intriguing and deserves more research than it gets, because mainstream science tends to avoid anything that smells like ghost research, worried about credibility, but that means potentially interesting environmental psychology questions go unasked, and you're too deeply asleep to solve these methodological problems, but you're aware that science's blind spots are sometimes the most interesting territories, and you're drifting now with phantom bagpipers through tunnels that might lead to other worlds, or might just lead to other tunnels, and either way the music echoes, either way the stories persist. The darkness behind your eyelids has become infinite, a void without borders or landmarks, and you're floating in this void while hearing about the Château de Brissac in France's Loire Valley, home to the Green Lady, who is supposedly the ghost of Charlotte de Brissac, who was murdered by her husband in the 15th century after he discovered her affair, and her ghost appears wearing a green dress with massive holes where her eyes should be, which is specifically horrifying and detailed enough to be interesting, and sightings have been reported for centuries, and the current Duke of Brissac, who owns the chateau and lives there, has confirmed that strange things happen. Sounds in empty rooms, cold spots that move, a general sense of presence, and he's opened the chateau to tourists, partly because maintaining these massive historical properties requires tourist income, and ghost tours have become part of the business model, which raises questions about economic incentives for maintaining hauntings, because a good ghost story is valuable for tourism, but the sightings predate the tourism by centuries, so it's not like the ghosts were invented for commercial purposes, they've just been monetized, which seems very practical and very French, and you're smiling slightly in your near sleep at the image of aristocrats marketing their ancestral ghosts as a business strategy, because if you're going to have a murdered ancestor haunting your home, you might as well charge admission, and the Green Lady walks through rooms where tourists now pose for selfies, eternal and ignored, seen and unseen, both real and unreal depending on who's looking, and that ambiguity is perfect for your current state of consciousness, where everything exists in superposition, both true and untrue, until you decide to care enough to observe, and you don't care, you're letting it all be whatever it wants to be. Your breathing has become so slow that entire universes could form between breaths, and you're hearing about the ghost of Queen Anne Boleyn, who was beheaded at the Tower of London in 1536 on charges that were almost certainly fabricated by Henry VIII because he wanted to marry someone else, and Anne supposedly walks the corridors of both the Tower and several other locations associated with her life, and the most famous sighting was in 1864, when a guard at the tower saw a light moving in a supposedly empty chapel and found a figure in old-fashioned dress walking without feet, gliding above the floor, and he challenged it, and when it didn't stop he charged through it with his bayonet, which went through without resistance, and he fainted, and was later court-martialed for falling asleep on duty, but acquitted when other guards testified they'd seen similar things, and sightings of Anne continue into the modern era. And she's also reported at Hever Castle, where she lived as a girl, and at Hampton Court Palace, where she spent time as queen, and the geographic distribution of her hauntings suggests either she's an unusually active ghost, or the legend has inspired copycat reports, and scholars who study folklore point out that famous tragic figures tend to accumulate ghost stories, whether or not any genuine phenomena occur, because we're drawn to the drama. We want to believe that violent deaths leave traces, and Anne Boleyn's story is compelling enough that people might unconsciously see her, even where she isn't, projecting the legend onto ambiguous experiences, and that's a more parsimonious explanation than literal ghosts. But it doesn't account for the guard in 1864, who had no apparent reason to invent a story that got him court-martialed, and you're too close to complete unconsciousness to untangle this. You're just holding the image of Anne Boleyn walking eternally through royal corridors, unable to rest, unable to leave, trapped by the violence of her death, or trapped by the stories people tell about her death, and maybe there's no difference. Your body has achieved perfect stillness, perfect temperature, perfect comfort, and you're hearing about the battlefield ghosts of Towton, site of the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, where on March 29, 1461, during the Wars of the Roses, somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 men fought in a blizzard, and by the end of the day 28,000 were dead or dying, the snow turning red with blood across acres of Yorkshire countryside, and every year on the anniversary, residents report strange phenomena, sounds of men fighting, cries of the wounded, the clash of weapons, figures in medieval armor appearing in the mist, and these reports are consistent enough that amateur paranormal investigators regularly visit on the anniversary date, and historians note that mass death events seem to generate particularly persistent legends, whether because something genuinely paranormal happens at sites of extreme violence, or because the human psyche can't process that scale of death without creating stories to contain it, and the Towton ghosts might be memory in landscape form, the earth itself remembering what happened there, or they might be psychological projections by people who know what happened and unconsciously hear what they expect to hear, or they might be actual hauntings if you believe in such things. And the debate continues among researchers and locals, and meanwhile the reports continue, year after year, March after March, as reliable as the changing seasons, and you're drifting across that bloody field now, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, just feeling the weight of all that death, all that violence, all that suffering that happened so long ago but somehow persists, echoing through time, reaching even into your dreams, and you're ready to let go completely now, ready to stop being conscious, ready to surrender to full sleep. The void around you is complete, total, and you're disappearing into it, like a drop of water returning to the ocean, and you're hearing one last story about the ghosts of plague victims who supposedly appear in various European cities, particularly in London, where the Great Plague of 1665 killed 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's population, and the dead were buried in mass graves and plague pits, and modern construction regularly uncovers these burial sites, workers finding layer upon layer of human remains, and supposedly these disturbances trigger ghost sightings, people in plague-era clothing appearing near the excavation sites, looking lost or confused or purposeful, walking through walls that didn't exist in their time, and these reports come from construction workers and passers-by, who often have no knowledge of what's buried there, only learning later that they saw ghosts near a plague pit, and skeptics note that London is old and densely populated and full of historical tragedy. You could throw a stone in any direction and hit something terrible that happened centuries ago. So it's not surprising that people report seeing ghosts, but the specificity of the reports, the plague-era clothing, the proximity to actual burial sites, the consistency across witnesses who don't know each other, all of this adds up to something more than random noise, maybe not proof of an afterlife, but at least proof that places hold memories somehow, through whatever mechanism we don't understand, electromagnetic fields or quantum entanglement, or just the power of human consciousness imprinting on physical space. And these plague victims walking through modern London are reminders that the past isn't past, it's present, It's always present. We're walking through layers of history every day, living on top of graves, building on top of tragedy, and sometimes those layers become visible, sometimes the dead appear to the living, and whether that's literally true or metaphorically true, doesn't matter as much as the feeling it creates. The awareness that we're connected to everyone who came before, that their suffering matters, that their stories persist, and you're barely conscious enough to receive this knowledge, but it's settling into you anyway, becoming part of your deepest understanding, and you're so grateful for these stories, for these legends that turned out to be true, for these impossible things that happened anyway, for this journey through medieval mystery and horror and wonder, and you're releasing everything now, letting go of thought, letting go of awareness, letting go of the need to know what's real and what's legend, because at this depth they're the same thing. They're all just stories we tell to make sense of existence, and existence is strange enough without our stories, but sweeter with them, richer, more meaningful, and as you finally cross over into true sleep, into the realm of dreams where anything can happen and usually does, you're carrying with you the knowledge that the world is full of wonders and terrors, that medieval legends were shockingly true, and probably our modern legends will turn out to be true too, in ways we can't predict, and that's beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. And somewhere in a castle in Scotland, a lady in green walks through empty rooms, and somewhere in France a worm coils around a hill, and somewhere in Italy people dance without stopping, and somewhere in the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn glides through stone corridors, looking for the head she lost 500 years ago, and all of it happened, all of it's happening, all of it will keep happening, as long as humans tell stories, and listen to stories, and let stories shape how we understand reality. And you're one of those storytelling humans. You're part of this ancient tradition of gathering in the dark, and whispering about impossible things that turn out to be true, and that's a privilege. That's a gift. And you're so comfortable now, so perfectly comfortable. Your body is at peace, your mind is at rest, and the last fragments of your consciousness are dissolving like mist in morning sun, and you're not fighting it, you're welcoming it. You're ready for the dreams that are waiting, ready for your own impossible stories to unfold in the theater of sleep. And the shocking truth is that you're safe, you're warm, you're comfortable, you're okay, everything is okay, and you can rest now, really rest, deep rest, medieval castle quiet rest, and the stories will be here tomorrow if you want them. Or you can find new stories, or you can make your own stories, but right now there's only this perfect moment of surrendering to sleep, and you're gone, almost entirely gone, just the faintest whisper of awareness remaining, and even that's fading, fading like candlelight in a medieval monastery, like a ghost in mourning, light, like a legend that's been told so many times it's become truth, and you're not sure anymore where the stories end, and your dreams begin, and that's perfect, that's exactly right, that's how it should be, and you're grateful, so grateful for this time, for this rest, for this journey through impossible truths, and true impossibilities, and you're letting go now completely, finally, releasing your grip on everything, falling backward into the infinite dark where sleep lives and dreams are born. And your last thought before you disappear entirely is that medieval people knew something we've forgotten, that the world is stranger than we imagine, stranger than we can imagine, and being open to that strangeness is what makes us fully human, fully alive, fully present to the mystery of existence. And then even that thought is gone, and there's only darkness, and breath, and the slow steady rhythm of a heart at rest, and somewhere very far away the stories are still being told, and somewhere very far away someone else is falling asleep to impossible truths that actually happened, and somewhere very far away the medieval world persists in legend and memory and ghost and grave, and it's all connected, all of it, across time and space and consciousness, one continuous story that we're all part of, whether we know it or not, and you know it now. In this moment you understand, and that understanding is carrying you down into the deepest sleep, the sweetest rest, and everything is okay. Everything has always been okay, and you're safe, and you're comfortable, and you're exactly where you need to be, and sleep is claiming you completely now, wrapping you in velvet void, and this is good, this is right, this is perfect, and somewhere in your sleeping mind, the medieval world continues, castles stand, ghosts walk, legends persist, shocking truths wait to be discovered, but you don't need to discover them tonight. Tonight you just need to rest, to sleep, to dream your own dreams. And that's what you're doing, that's what you're becoming. Pure rest, pure peace, pure sleep, and the last thing you hear before consciousness ends entirely is your own breath. In and out, the ancient rhythm that's been with you since birth, and will be with you until death, connecting you to every human who ever lived, every medieval person who breathed this same air, and wondered at this same strange world. And that connection is a gift, and you're grateful for it, as you sink down into the infinite dark, and rest and dream, and let go, completely, finally, blessedly, and